Thank you all for being here, for joining together. It is such an honor to be in your midst, any time to be with others who are on this shared journey of this grief experience that we will all experience through our life. But to know that we are not alone, that's the most important thing. So anytime that I can come out and to be present, to talk with, to share, to learn from, to be with those in grief and those who support those who are in grief, it's an honor. So as I said, my name is Roxanne. I am in the St. Cloud area. I have a background in social work. I've been a social worker for close to about 30 years, I think. It kind of shows my age now. And then since 2000, I have been focusing in specifically on grief and loss. I had come into the program of Catholic Charities Life Transition Services. It's a very small program of Catholic Charities. That was the grief and loss program. We did programming in the areas of death and divorce. We have some people here who had been such instrumental parts of that programming, doing some grief groups in the Little Falls area. So in that program, we would do support groups for various losses, widowed persons, child loss, suicide loss, divorce groups. I could meet with people individually and just be that companion, that supporter along the way. Other things that I've done, I just want to reference just to put it into a little bit of the context in case you are familiar with some resources in the area. I've volunteered with a most wonderful organization that was created by the Minnesota Funeral Home Association called the Children's Grief Connection. And so with that program, they do grief camps. Start off with serving kids, kindergarten through 12th grade, 2 to 3 times a year as a grief camp for kids to come together, to be close to other kids who've had somebody in their life has died. And then as they've expanded through these many, many years, they have now created it as a family grief camp. So it happens twice a year, and it's the most wonderful opportunity. It's a weekend where, again, families come together to learn about grief and grief impacts and to support each other and to express themselves, to know also that they're not alone. So I think throughout this time I probably have volunteered for about 30 of those grief camps. They will come up in case anybody is interested for your families or anybody that you know of. They do the camps the first weekend in April and then the first weekend in November. So they set it out into those 2 different time frames and at different camp locations in different parts of the state of it. I facilitate a couple of suicide loss support groups. We know that grief impacts hit us because of relational connections and the manner of death, and all of those have different variations in how we're going to experience that grief process and those grief reactions. So we do a suicide loss group in Melrose once a month and in St. Cloud, and I've come to Little Falls a couple of different times and done some things specific to suicide death with it. So again, just a little bit of that background of where I come from. I now work as a mental health therapist, so as a psychotherapist in Waite Park, and a lot, not all, but a lot of my clients are there because of grief impacts. And then I also do a little bit of work at a Catholic church in St. Cloud. So just wanted that variety. So as we come together here, we'll spend this hour just being here and hearing and learning and sharing from each other. I'll have a PowerPoint that we'll touch base on, and it will hit some of those elemental aspects about grief. One of the most important things that we can learn about grief is that it's a natural and normal reaction to a loss. And it doesn't feel all the time that it feels so natural or so normal. But the main thing for anybody and everybody to recognize is how you are going through the process. This long and hard and difficult and oftentimes has those devastating moments. how you are going through that process, unless it is causing harm to you or harm to another. This is how that process is. So I hope that during our time here that people might feel free, if they want, to share some things about either what they have experienced or what has helped them, or anything that they want to share. You will be welcome at different times. I'll invite that in if you have any questions to ask it at any time. Because we're being recorded for cable TV, I'll repeat the question or the comments that anybody has, but hopefully we can make this a little bit interactive. I know that there are some of my role models, some of my grief idols that are here in the audience that I have learned so much from. But each of you are an expert on your grief journey. And so coming from that place. And then throughout this time, I'll also share little bits about some of my own grief experiences. So as you, grief has touched my life at different points in time. And as some of you that I've just have heard already, sometimes it just comes in these waves. It just comes really, really layered. It's like, how can we even wrap our head around one loss before another happens? So very, very briefly, from my own experience, a year ago in May, we experienced the death of my beloved 98-year-old aunt. She was my godmother and lived in her home up until the last week or two and had just a wonderful life. And as she came to end of life, it was sad. It was really, really sad. But it was just part of that life journey, that life process. So that was in May. Then in July, I had my oldest brother was diagnosed with pervasive cancer. So as we experienced that, he was hospitalized for a little bit. Then he had to go home and recover because of some blood clots in his lungs that they found in addition to the cancer before he could undergo treatment. So I told our mom that her oldest son had this pervasive cancer on a Saturday morning. And this was in that second week of July. And that Sunday morning, she woke up and she knew that she was dying that day. And so everybody gathered around. She was dying that day. And so we all prepared and we responded to anything and everything that she wanted. What we realized by that afternoon is what she was actually doing. She was having a panic attack. But it was so intense for her. And she was living with pneumonia. And she had just gone on oxygen that Friday night before. And so going through all of this trauma within her own health and then hearing about her oldest son. But from that moment, from that day on, that Sunday in July, we knew that the end was coming. And so we stayed with her 24 hours a day. Thank goodness we had a large family. And we're able to piggyback. And day and night, we were with her for 10 weeks. She ended up dying on September 16th, which was 16 days before her oldest sister died. We did not expect that other aunt to die. She died on August 30th. Our mom died 16 days later. That was the end of that generation, that whole generation that happened, that held such importance for us. Coming back now again into this May, my sister's stepson unexpectedly died at age 40. And then 2.5 weeks ago, my brother died. And so this is the stuff of life. This is what we go through. Sometimes we go through an awful lot of it at the same time. Sometimes, so hopefully it is spaced off. But it was an interesting 1.5 years for me in doing this grief work for these 18 years, and then being a grieving niece, certainly being a grieving daughter, now experiencing grief as a sister, watching my sister with this stepson who she just loved as her son, had been in their life for since he was 8 years old with it. So I had this whole different perspective as a grieving person. And as I would be overcome with grief and that expression, I didn't like it. I came with a whole new philosophy of grief. Grief is hard. Grief sucks. Was kind of my conclusion. But I would attune to my reaction sometime, and I'm like, okay, where is this in the balance of things? How do I feel like I'm doing? And so walked side by side as this professional in grief and as this person experiencing these different layers of grief and watching this process. So for whatever reasons that you are here, I am just thankful that you are here. Most of the time when I was at that grief program of Catholic Charities, when people would come in, they would, they're living with their experience, and then finally they either learn of the resources, they find the courage. Grief takes such courage, but when they would find the courage to call up and say, can I come and meet with you? And oh, absolutely, let's find a time. They come, and at that time we're working out of this program out of a house that was in Sauk Rapids, and it was just a very, very comfortable environment. So we'd sit down on the couches in the living room and say, tell me what's going on. Almost invariably, the first thing that they would say was, I think I'm going crazy. Right? Yeah, I just think I'm going crazy. I don't get this. And I'm like, oh, it has to be hard. What's going on? Tell me about that. And then they'd talk about things like, I can't remember things, or I'm just crabby, I'm angry, and I'm not really an angry person, and I just don't have any energy, and all of these other kinds of things. And I'd be like, yeah, you're in grief. You're not going crazy. Grief is crazy making.
How do we go about leading people to appropriate expressions of grief? I'm a retired teacher. I had students who died, suicide, cancer, variety of things. And there were times when the class did not know how to express it. Mm-hmm. There were some very inappropriate things. I tried to talk them through it, but really at that point there were not the resources that I thought should have been there.
How do we lead people to appropriate expressions of grief, and how do we support them? That's a huge thing. And we'll talk about some responses that grievers might have, and then ways of coping, ways of expressing themselves, that's supporting others. Boy, that's always a big thing. That's one of the things that we talk about in support groups a lot, and that I talk about in counseling or at the grocery store or wherever I encounter people and we have this wonderful opportunity to have a grief conversation, is some of the stupid things that people say, oftentimes out of best intentions. Sometimes just out of ignorance, sometimes just out of not knowing what to say, sometimes out of their own interest or focus or whatever. And then what are responses that are helpful and supportive? So we will talk about that in these different responses and things. So help me remind me if we don't get to some very concrete areas of that. How do we lead people? That's not my role as a grief professional, as a grief supporter, as a grief companion. It's not my role to lead anybody anywhere. To be there, to listen, to support, to companion, and we'll use that word a lot, this companioning with others. To educate, absolutely. To help them find what they need, to help them find resources, to both their internal resources and support within their family, within their community, within maybe their faith community, whatever supports that they have in their life, to find very, very safe places. We need safe places to grieve because our society does not want us to grieve. Our society wants us to be sad for a little bit, 3 days, maybe, and kind of suck it up, get on with it, move on. When we know that grieving is about this. Grieving is about remembering, about honoring, about reflecting, about getting grounded, about putting one step in front of the other as we can. That's what grieving is about. But it's not about getting over. And how often do we hear that, you need to get over it, you need to move on, you need to get back to work, back to school, back into activities, you need to, you should, all those kinds of things. They need to do what they need to do with it. So as we look at remembering, we actually have the most beautiful example from the Christian perspective of Jesus. And what Jesus did at the Last Supper in holding up the bread. And as with Catholics, as they experience during Mass at the Eucharist, when they hold up the host and they say, "Do this in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me." So there is a grief expert named William Wolden, and he lays out 4 tasks of mourning. The first one is to come to the reality of the loss. To come to the reality. That's a long process. That's in that, yes, I know that they died, and yet, I thought I caught a glimpse of them or heard their voice, or setting a table and just putting down that seating where they would always be, or this stuff that can catch us by unaware of, oh my gosh, yeah. So this task, this long process, and there's no time frame on any of this, but coming to that reality of that this is final, that they're physically not here. But then the last task out of these 4, so I won't touch on the second and third. The last task is, how do we relocate? How do we relocate our loved one in whatever way? Carrying them in our heart, through our memories, through sharing the stories, through pictures, through honoring them, through tributes, through whatever, through companioning with them. I often talk about grief walking. And do you ever, for those that go out walking and things, do you ever take your loved one along? Do you walk with them and talk with them, or say good morning, or say I love you, or light a candle, or in whatever way that we honor their presence, but not in that physical way? That's a healthy response. That's not hanging on to grief, or they're in denial, they can't accept what happened or anything like that. They live on as long as love lives on. And as long as love lives on, we want to honor that. And so this relocating. So in doing this, throughout this, there'll be some different reflections that just kind of maybe hit us in a different way. So we can understand grief in an intellectual or a cognitive way by some of the things that we'll talk about, but then also to experience grief in this spiritual or emotive way, or something that just touches our soul. So this beautiful picture, look at that, kind of dark on the outside, that little bit of light in the middle. This quote from Charles Dickens. This is what grief was like for him. And can it be that in a world so full and busy, the loss of one creature makes a void so wide and deep that nothing but the width and depth of eternity can fill it up? This void so wide and so deep. I entered into that void for quite a while after my mom died. So everything is in context of relationship. We often hear, well, what is the worst kind of grief? Is it death of a spouse, that life partner? Is it that death of a child? Is it death by suicide? Is it, we kind of want to get into doing comparisons. And I always say that there is a worse kind of grief. And that's what you're experiencing. Because what you're experiencing is about that relationship, about that love, about that connection, about what was, maybe about what was never there. We grieve that as well as what was there, about what will not be, kind of a thing. So in my life, my mom was one of the most important people in my life. And so that loss of her created for me, for quite a while, this deep and vast void with it. And it kind of looked like that. And oftentimes a little bit more clouded. Good. Helen Keller said, "I never knew how much I loved my father until I lost him. How shall I bear it?" Again, oftentimes we can prepare ourselves, we can do what's called anticipatory grief. We did this certainly with each of these deaths in my family. We were with our mom for 10 weeks. And I knew way before that I was preparing myself for when she would die. She was not in good health. And then in those 10 weeks, just knowing and preparing and things. But at that time of death, it doesn't take away what can be that devastating experience at that time when that actuality finally happens. So all different types of grief and ways that we that we might experience it, knowing it or not even necessarily knowing it. So what can help is can we kind of put our finger on it? Can we kind of define it? What's going on? And so when we can recognize, well, this is pretty typical. Oh yeah, that's right. That lady said that this was normal. Now I can know, that at least I'm not, going crazy. Like those people would come in and say, I think I'm going crazy. So we know that grief tends to be this emotional impact with that heaviness of our heart and sadness. Tears are often a part of grief expression, but don't have to be, but oftentimes that they are. So we get that emotional context of it. We don't necessarily know that grief takes up so much energy, and it can be just all focusing, that we do become, at different times, more impatient, irritable, crabby, angry. It's just all of this emotion that's just bubbling up there that needs some kind of expression. Sometimes it comes out in tears or in sharp tones or in withdrawal or in depression. There is a natural component of depression that people may experience in grief. And then people also may experience major depression. And so when it goes from depressive grief into major depression, then there needs to be more tenderness, more care, more support with that. But for people to be down and have a lot of the symptoms that we might expect somebody with depression to have, that would be pretty typical. We don't necessarily realize all the other impacts that grief has on us, though. That grief impacts us physically, that we become tired and low energy, and that our chest might hurt, and our stomach might hurt, and our digestive system might change, and sleep pattern might change, and just have these aches and pains. That can be a pretty typical experience. I had a woman once when she came in to see me and said she didn't know what was going on. She just had all this intensity of things, and she talked about after her mom died. She's like, I was in the bathroom. I was just over the toilet. I just felt so sick to my stomach. I was just vomiting. Like, yeah, that had to be really hard. Boy, you really felt that intensely, didn't you? Oftentimes, I would ask people, and I will ask you all now also, where are you carrying grief in your body? Grief will oftentimes settle in. And we might not recognize it in our body, but we carry it. So sometimes it's in the shoulders, just feels like this heavy weight. Oftentimes in the chest. I sit in therapy sessions with people in grief, and I will just watch them do this. And they don't even know that they're doing this. We'll be talking, and then it comes into the natural moment of silence, and they'll go, talking. So I name that the deep grief sigh. You just need to expel it. So think for yourselves as you've encountered your different grief experiences, if that's ever come. It's a release of what is pent up, what's held there. People oftentimes will hold grief in their abdominal area, so upset stomach or just distress, maybe in their lower back, wherever, neck, tension. Sometimes grief is just held right here. Our body knows, and our body honors. Grief is a cognitive experience. Oh my gosh, we forget, and that focus and that remembering, that concentration in things. I will usually tell people very concrete things. You know, it's like, okay, in those first few weeks and months or so, give a neighbor a key to your house. Write down things, make lists. You're going to go to the grocery store and you're going to stand in that aisle and you're like, I don't know what I'm here for. And might end up walking away with some things that, I don't know why I'm getting this, but it affects our thinking ability. And that's hard for people when that's kind of, what they've counted on is, I know people's names and dates and I don't forget anything and I know when I put things down and I always pay my bills on time and now I just feel like a wreck because it's all falling apart. You're in grief. That's how it is. Get some supports. So having other people check in or giving you those reminders. We have a lot of technology now that we can use for those types of things. Make lists for your lists and put things in various places. And sometimes draw little arrows or whatever that it's going to be because it does. It's hard to read. So when people want resources, and resources are a wonderful avenue of just getting things that will support you. I try to find books that are thin, that have big font, and that, short paragraphs. And I tell people, take this, and if you read it, great. If you remember it, even better. You might need to read it a couple of different times. Read what you want. Read a page or a paragraph or a couple of pages or so. Put it down. Come back. Just know that you might need to go back into it a couple of different times or whatever. Skim through. Find headlines that catch your attention. You don't have to read a book from cover to cover, kind of a thing. Just know that it's hard to focus and concentrate. And know that for the most part that comes back. We come back into capacity in all of these areas. That time frame, we don't know, but that we do come back into our ability. Grief is a social experience. Oftentimes we might want to pull in. It's a time of protectiveness, of wrapping ourselves up. Ellen Wolfelt, who's a grief expert out of Colorado, he has a beautiful imagery of this called cocooning. That oftentimes in grief, we might have periods of time when we just want to cocoon, going deep inside for all of that internal work to happen. And sometimes we can cocoon with a blanket or a shawl or a jacket or in bed or whatever. Sometimes we cocoon wherever that we are. So when people don't want to join in social activities as much or at all, can we honor that? We know that isolating isn't always the most healthy response, but periods of time of slower activity, of what I advise people to do, especially as we're coming up on the holidays, is try to find your own transportation if you drive or have somebody that will bring you and take you when you want to go. Go late and leave early so that you have some sense of control. Because being around others, and especially during this holiday time now, when it's supposed to be so merry and bright and happy and jolly and everything, it's not where our spirit might be. So we can go do a little bit, but then be where we feel safe, where we can be ourselves. Grief often is a spiritual experience. Sometimes it can just really deepen our faith, and our faith can be a strong source of support. I intentionally called this presentation the grace of grief, experiencing the grace of grief. But it can also create turmoil. Why did this happen? Trying to understand, trying to reconcile. How can a loving God, or whatever we call our higher power, how could they allow this to happen if it was suffering or accidental or suicide or devastate, whatever that it might be. And so we can get in there and we can wrestle with it. If there was a funeral, if that was in a faith community, in a church or whatever, it can be really hard going back into that environment. At different times during services, just kind of can overwhelm and flow over. I know for myself, again, it's after communion. It's a more quiet, more meditative time. The music is more evoking of the emotions. It's typically where my tears come. And you know, as much as I try to stifle them and hold them back and things, they sometimes they just flow. And that is, that's that expression, that's that reaction. Whatever that our responses is, again, there are such things as prolonged grief or not healthy coping. In my 18 years of doing grief work, I've never really met anybody who's been stuck in their grief. They've been in some really hard, deep places, and it's been hard to see the light from it. But for the most part, what we're experiencing is that natural and normal response to this devastating loss. If we know what to expect, we can prepare ourselves. Or we can say, oh yeah, that makes sense with it. C.S. Lewis said after the death of his wife, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness." So all of those different reactions. Such a variety. These are just some of the common responses that we may have. Sadness, fear, flashbacks, anxiety, sleep changes, low energy, keeping busy. How many times do we say that, or do we hear other people say that? You just need to keep busy. If I just keep myself busy enough, then I don't have to think about it. Yeah, you know, and keeping busy has a role. It has a place. But no matter how busy that we keep ourselves, we come into stillness at whatever point of time, day or night. There's time for grief with it. And so we need to experience what we're experiencing. Guilt, that can be a major thing. Regret. These are some hard emotions that we might go through. And it's easy for others to want to help the griever feel better. And we will say, oh, you don't have to feel guilty. You did everything that you could. Or look how strong that you are. Look at, all of those things that you went through and things. You don't have anything to regret. You did everything you could have done. I have a lot of regrets. Even though 10 weeks I was there with my mom, there was times when I was not. When I chose to go to work or do other things. A lot of regrets with my brother, a lot of regrets in other ways. And you know what? Those are for me to own. I need to be with them. I need to process them. I need to reflect on them. I need to honor them. I need to hold them until I don't need to hold them anymore. Forgiveness. What a wonderful grace that is as we can come to that. Certainly we would forgive others for some of those things that we hold ourselves accountable for. That self-forgiveness is really powerful. What do you say to people? That is always the biggest thing of how do we respond to grievers. And so, it depends. It all depends. It depends on the relationship that you have with the person. The better that you know them, the more that you can enter into. Things that we can say to strangers that can be very comforting, but if I know somebody in a different relational context, I will express it in different ways. It depends on the environment, where I'm going to say something different at the gas station than I am in a living room or at church or wherever. But if we honor our heart and trust that words are important, but the way that they're conveyed is even more important. The eye contact, the voice tone, the expression, kind of a thing. So a natural thing to say shortly after you recognize that a person had a loss is, I just heard or I learned that. I'm so sorry. So sorry for your loss. Use a person's name. How much that we value hearing that name when that person isn't here anymore. Sometimes it's more about making statements than asking questions. I hope that you're finding support. I know that this is difficult. Those kinds of things. Can ask, how are you doing? Oftentimes I will say, I will adjust that to, how are you doing right now? Because how they're doing right now might be different in an hour, might be different in a day or in a week, kind of a thing. They'll typically, depending on the context, the relationship, the place where you're at and things, they'll typically give what we call the big grief lie. Everybody know what that is? How are you doing? I'm fine. Yeah. You know, and oftentimes they will, you know, they will adjust their response to the context, to the person who's asking, to the time, to how they're feeling at that time. And if they say that they're fine, I'm glad. I know that this is it's gonna go up and down, kind of a thing. So getting that in there. Oftentimes, tell me about, not necessarily about how they died. That's up for them to share. But tell me about, or if you knew the person, share a special memory. Now, I remember when I ran into him and we were talking about this, and had the biggest smile. It was so great, kind of a thing. So, reaching out. One of the hardest things is to do something. Saying nothing, because I don't want to bring it up to them in case that they're not thinking about it. No, it's with them. For years, it's with them. I don't want to make them cry. Look at where we pull back, though, out of not wanting that natural expression of emotion. If somebody cries, you know what? We can be there with them. And so oftentimes we don't say anything because I don't want to make them cry. Maybe that's a shared experience. That's a beautiful, grace-filled experience with it. The tears will dry up. Maybe they'll cry a little bit, maybe it will be a lot, but then to not be alone in that moment, to have somebody just be side by side with them, kind of thing.
I kind of cringe when I hear that, how are you feeling? A friend of mine and I were talking with a woman whose husband had died. Her response was was not what either of us expected. But what she said was, I feel like somebody just ripped my heart out.
Yeah, what a beautiful reflection. So
that was as honest and as raw as you can get.
And so to say, well, how are you feeling? And then somebody says, I feel like somebody just ripped my heart out. What a great expression. That just really described how she was. And so I see that as just the most authentic exchange. And some people might go into that and say that. I think that that's beautiful. But are we prepared? Are we prepared for the answer? Don't ask the question if you're not prepared for the answer. If you don't have that moment, if you don't have that connection, if you're doing it out of curiosity, out of whatever, that's not the time to go into it.
That question was asked because I think he felt like he had to say something, and that answer blew both of us away.
And went in with that general polite question, oh, how are you doing? And then you got it. Yeah, if you ask the question, be prepared, you know. And it might be anger. It might be, how the hell do you think I'm feeling? My whatever just died and things. Can you receive that? That anger is not about you. It's about that powerlessness of the loss with it. About a year or so ago, I was meeting with a woman whose son died of a drug overdose. He spent almost all of his adult life in prison. Okay, really hard, just really hard family dynamics, a lot of hurt. This is her son, and she was devastated. It didn't matter that he had this drug addiction, or that's the reason why he died. It was her son. But how many people share memories, loving memories, kindnesses, his smile, anything about that? Yeah, well, he shouldn't have done meth. Yeah, well, of course. That's not helpful with it. Can we find a way? Every life has value. Every life is precious. Every life deserves to be honored. And every life had somebody at one point in time that shared love with it. And that's why we grieve. Our grief reactions, our grief is in proportion to our love. And when we don't want the grief, I wanted my grief just to be taken away. I did not want to be sitting at my kitchen table, heaved over with sobs, as I did last winter. But I knew that I was honoring the love I had for my mom. And so we can find lots and lots of ways of avoiding grief and diverting it and shortcutting it and whatever. Grief will be there. And the way that we get through it is to go through it. That's where the deep true healing is. So oftentimes I will look at an imagery of this journey. So grief as a road or a path. So on this image of this lifetime journey, isn't that kind of discouraging with it? But when you think about this journey, okay, sometimes when we're starting out, sometimes we have a roadmap, sometimes we don't. Sometimes the road is really hard and really rough. Maybe we have high mountains and hills to climb, and then we come into the deep, deep valleys, and we just feel like we're rolling down this out of control with it. So that's oftentimes our journey of grief in that beginning. It is so hard and arduous, that work that we go through in the first few weeks and months and years. Those first couple of years of grief with it. Okay. Discouraging that it can be, but also know that on this journey, sometimes there are places of repose. We need places of repose where we can rest. We need quiet waters where we can sit and be. We need activity along it. We need companions. We need supporters in whatever way that will journey with us for whatever amount of time on that journey, different people along the way. And eventually we find our way through. We find our way through our grief. So I knew for myself, with that ebb and flow of that last year and a half with my aunts, sometimes I would have to sit and I'd have to think, okay, I am just really, really sad right now. Is this about my mom? Is this about my aunt? Is this about Jeffrey, my sister's stepson? I had to do some sifting. I had to do some sorting out at times. And I knew those different times when this journey was going to get harder. So I knew my parents' anniversary. I knew Mother's Day. I knew I was prepared that my birthday was going to be hard. I didn't know how hard that my birthday was going to be. My first birthday in my life without my mom. Okay? So sometimes we can prepare for this spot in the journey. Sometimes it will just come up on us. I knew the holidays last year were, I laid on the couch on Christmas Eve. That's all I could do, kind of a thing. Went to the cemetery at like 10:30 at night. Put a little candle out, kind of a thing. How do we honor the journey that we're on? And then I knew of that 1 year anniversary. I knew I wanted to go into quietude. So I had heard about this beautiful hermitage that was outside of Princeton. So I made just one night reservation there. I just went and I sat by the water. That's where my journey was at that time. I just wanted to be by that stillness of water on that night before she died. And I wanted to walk among the trees. And I need to include it into this PowerPoint because I saw this one tree that I kept coming back to. It was just the most amazing thing. And I use this now a lot in therapy. So it was a really, really skinny tree just in the midst in this meadow with all these other trees. So it's a really skinny tree. It was really tall. And about 2/3 of the way up, it had this amazing knot in it. That knot was like literally, the tree was about that wide. That knot was like this big. And then the tree had growth past that. And I couldn't, because of all the other trees, I couldn't see how high that tree was. But I'm like, that is a tree that's had grief. I could identify with that tree. So that night before my mom died on that 1 year anniversary, and then that morning of, I went back, I just kept going back and I stood in front of that tree. And I just felt this commonality. That was a support for me at that time. That tree was. So we never know where companions on our journey are going to be. but we need to find our own path through this. So, some of the things that helps in grief, whatever that it might be talking, it might be sharing, it might be crying, it might be not crying. Some people never cry. It might be support groups, it might be being alone, it might be praising God, it might be being angry at God. Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So if Jesus said it, we can say it. Might be music or journaling. There's so many different expressions of grief. Oftentimes we think that grief needs to look this one way and then this is what helps. So in the story of Lazarus with his sisters Martha and Mary, they both experience the same grief experience with their brother dying. They have very, very different grief reactions. So if you remember anything about the story, Martha, so after they called for Jesus, and Jesus didn't come for 3 days, and then when Jesus is on his way, and they're like, what the heck? Lazarus has died. He's been dead for 3 days. Martha runs out to meet Jesus. Where were you? We needed you. You weren't here. Mary is home, in the home. But we can use this as a representation of different grieving styles. It's kind of like our response in life, but it fits very, very well with grief. So we think about reactions to grief. It's kind of like on a continuum, on a line. On one end, there are the Marys, male or female. They're more the intuitive grievers, the emotional grievers, the expressive grievers. They might need to talk or to cry or to journal or to process in whatever way. That they're more expressive in how they share their grief. Okay, very few of us are on either end of this continuum, but you know, it's this kind of line. Then on this other end would be Marthas or the doers, the instrumental grievers, tasks. They're the ones who maybe organize or clean the house or chop the wood or they get stuff done. That's how they just handle things. When emotions get high, they get going. They do stuff. Both of them are very, very good, very valid, very expressive responses to grief. But what we tend to do, especially when grief is more recent, we look at people and we say, oh, they just need to cry. They haven't cried yet. When they cry, then they'll get it out. So sometimes this is what our expectations are to others when they're in grief. You know, they just need to. And it kind of comes back into reflection on what our style is. What I feel most comfortable is what I think other people should be doing. But, you know, if they just cry, they just need to break down, they just need to let it all out. Marthas don't need to cry. Or maybe they cry in the car or in the shower or whatever. But that's not how they express themselves. What we end up doing is we're more compassionate towards the Marys, towards the intuitive grievers initially. They get a lot of support. But then after a while, after a few months, after a year, after a couple of years, oh my gosh, they're still going on and on. They just need to get over it. They just don't have a handle on it. We do a lot of judging. We look at the Marthas, the instrumental grievers, you know, they just need to let that emotion out and stuff. And then after a while, aren't they so strong? Look at how strong that they are in handling it. So different ways of expression with it. Another way of visualizing this is, are you a heart griever? That would be the Mary, the intuitive style. Are you a hand griever? That would be the Marthas, the doers. Or are you a head griever? The ones that need to go internal and just kind of process or read or do whatever. So heart, hand, or head. Again, we don't fall into just only one category. So at the grief camps, and we do this now as family camps. So we provide for childcare. So there are infants and 2-year-olds that do some activities, but you know, the 2 and 4-year-olds to whatever they can. But kindergartners, so from age 5, and we've had ones in their 90s. We know that grief needs to be expressed in a lot of different ways. So we do sharing circles. We sit, you know, break down into groups and we talk about, and so some of that sharing, and there's a lot of tears that happen there. We do education, especially with the adults, but even with the kids, to help them understand what they're going through and put it into context. And then we do a lot of other expressive things. We do drumming. And 5-year-olds and 95-year-olds in their own groups, they will be banging on drums. What does sadness sound like? What does anger sound like? What does love sound like? So a way of, for those instrumental, those hand grievers, to have a way. We do yoga for what you can do with a 5-year-old and things, but we learn some ways of just breathing and settling and calming and things. Do a lot of drawing and some projects, some hands-on stuff. Whole body experiences, because we are whole body grievers. So one of the most important things in grief is to share. We share our experience, not to compare. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, as long as we're not hurting ourselves or others. Don't should on yourself. I need to say this very carefully because we're going to be on YouTube. Don't should on yourself, and don't allow others to should on you. Now that one, so I have to pronounce that good. But you should be doing this, you should. Do what feels right. Honor your heart. Find things that have been helpful. We often get that question, how long does grief last? When will I be over it? I just can't do this. Kind of let me know. When am I going to get back to normal? Grief lasts as long as it lasts. So when people say this, then I ask them, especially when we look at mourning, how long does mourning last? It's like, when you get up in the morning, and if you get up before dawn, can you put your finger on when it's morning? morning. But isn't that the same with mouring? So it doesn't, what I say is that there's good news, bad news about grief. The good news is that it gets easier. It does. It doesn't remain in that intensity of those first few weeks or months or those first few years. The bad news is that we don't get over it. But then it comes back into good news also. To say, do you want to get over that love? Would anybody want to get over that love of that person or whatever it was that was lost? I don't want to ever get over that love. And grief is that reflection of that love. The beauty of the rose and how tender and soft that a rose is. We can just visualize this beautiful, perfect rose bud. But a rose has thorns. And the thorn of love is grief. So can we be tender? Can we not judge ourselves or others? Can we be supportive? Can we walk with it, knowing this path does ease off? That there will be at different times, there'll be grief moments, grief bursts along the way that can come years and years down the road. That's that reflection of that love. But it softens as we learn to relocate our loved one side by side, still in our life, still an important part, but that life travels on this journey that we go. And so, in experiencing healing, beautiful reflection that in the midst of winter, I found at last there was within myself an invincible summer. An invincible summer. That summer will arise again. It will. We need to just trust. We need to trust the process. We need to trust ourselves. From the Psalms, I shall not die, but I shall live. And that you will start to open up to life again. And you will start with moments of joy that become a little bit more expansive. And anticipation and looking forward, always knowing that our road continues where we were, where we are, where we shall be. So that myth of closure. You don't get closure on grief, but you do grow. You get sadder and wiser, and you do, more often than not, get the opportunity to help fellow travelers. Closure is a myth, but healing and recovery are not. We don't have to get to a place of acceptance. That stages of grief that I've been taught not to teach. So that denial and bargaining and anger and depression, and then you come to acceptance. We don't have to come to acceptance of it. We can, but moreover, maybe we come to peace, maybe we come to reconciliation, maybe we come to adjustment. You don't have to come to, they just need to get to acceptance. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, her young son that was kidnapped and killed, she said, I'll never accept it. It will always be there and hurting, like something in my eye. She went on to have a wonderful life, but it was a life without her son. And she said she would never accept it. There's a woman in Cold Spring who does a lot of public talking, speaking about suicide after her young adult son died by suicide. And she says, yeah, devastating. My heart was ripped out with it. Life has gone on. She's taken those steps for her other children, very active in her community, making meaning. She does, if you've heard of Let the Sun Shine run in Cold Spring, an annual run in April in honor of her son Jonathan that has raised tens of thousands of dollars for mental health. She said, I will never forgive myself. I will always feel guilty. She didn't do anything, that she was a loving, protective mom. Her son died by suicide. She said, I was his mom. I can feel that guilt and I can go on with life. And life can have meaning and value. There can be grace in grief. We don't often think of that as a gift. Who wants to receive the gift of grief? But what typically happens is we grow deeper in compassion, in empathy, in reaching out. And then what others have said that have been supportive to me, I can pass on to somebody else. I can show up at the wake or the funeral or send a card or hold them in thought or offer a blessing. Our compassion typically is enhanced. And in that way, there is grace in grief. And so, in ending, I want to a wise philosopher, Winnie the Pooh, but this is actually a quote from Christopher Robin to Winnie the Pooh, but Winnie the Pooh has some wise words also. But the words of Christopher Robin, hold this in your heart. If ever there is a tomorrow when we're not together, there's something you must always remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we're apart, I will always be with you. And we can walk on with our loved ones relocated in our heart, but by our side. Good. So that takes us almost to that time. So until we're reunited with our loved ones, find what you can hold on to, whatever that it is. Hope, faith, love, peace, relationship, meaning, purpose. We have to find things that we can hold on to, things that can ground us. And so, the grace in grief. Grief offers opportunities for broken hearts to reach out to others in compassion, to reassess what is important, to move forward as better individuals, and to help others as fellow companions on the journey. So at this time, at whatever place that you are on your journey, I wish you the grace of grief as you enter the sacred place that's created when we open ourselves to fully experience our grief. The grace in grief.